Many of us may have seen this image last summer of a small child pulled from the rubble of a fallen apartment building in Aleppo, Syria. Her face and body dirty with debris, and her eyes deeply in pain. Images like this one are all too common, and each one of us find them so profoundly disturbing. And we're overwhelmed that there's a brutal war affecting millions as we live our daily lives. And we find ourselves potentially becoming numb to these images, one by one. But I could not ignore this image of this child with her sweet face, her long dark lashes, and her deep brown eyes, because she reminded me so much of my own little boy, Elliot, about the same age. Her name is Aya. First, I found myself struck selfishly by this situation and thought, that could be my child. And my heart broke for the deep humanity and suffering that might have been felt by her family. Then, as my heart awoke to a larger view of this whole problem, I found myself struck by a deeper humanity. This is everyone's child. Aya is everyone's child. Now, that's not to say that I had not been following the Syrian Civil War. As a professor in international affairs, I regularly lecture on current events in the international system. And I had lectured on the Syrian Civil War dozens of times. Each time I would begin with a map of the Middle East, and I would explain that the Middle East is comprised of 15 countries, all on or around the Arabian Peninsula. And I would then point out Syria, just north of the Arabian Peninsula, and I would explain that this is the country that's filled with internal conflict, and that there are other countries around it that also have internal conflict, such as Israel and Iraq. And I would explain that the Syrian Civil War actually started out with a peaceful protest as part of the larger Arab Spring. In 2011, thousands of Syrians took to the streets, demanding their dictator for greater representation in their government. In response, Assad, the leader in Syria, responded to these protests with violent suppression. Pretty soon, these protesters took up weapons, became an insurgent group loosely called the Free Syrian Army, and a civil war ensued. This civil war has been lasting for 7 years, and it's seemingly intractable for 3 reasons. In addition to the 2 sides I've just described, there are still other actors in this conflict. First, we have non-state actors, the Kurds, an ethnic group in the northeast that's attempting to struggle to gain territory for themselves that might one day become their own country. And ISIL, an extremist group that's using the chaos of war in an attempt to gain more power and territory for themselves. In addition to this conflict is also along sectarian lines of Islam. The Iranian government, Shia government, supports the Assad regime, whereas other governments within the Middle East, Sunni-led, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, support the insurgents. And still, finally, there are also global actors that are playing a role in this conflict. The US and Russia have both historically been involved on opposite sides. As a result, these actors are so embattled, and this conflict has created an unprecedented power vacuum, so much so that we have a divided Syria that looks like this. I had taught many times about this, but what I hadn't done was actually consider the other actors, the human actors, like Aya, on the ground in a conflict not of their choosing. At the political level, you think only about the strategies of the militarily powerful. But when I started to turn my attention to the human level, I found an unfortunately profound amount of suffering. I also found a pretty silent international community. But upon reflection, I found many areas in which you and I can take potential actions to help alleviate some of this pain. So as a scholar of international relations, I study food insecurity. Specifically, I study how political leaders address food insecurity in their own countries. Now, food insecurity exists when people do not have the nutritional requirements they need to sustain their lives. And to taking this new, very personal, profound connection to the Syrian Civil War and my scholarly focus, I turned my attention to a rather disturbing and dramatic issue going on within this civil war. That is, that the government of Syria and their ally Russia are strategically targeting bakeries that are meant to feed civilians. Now, why bakeries, you might ask? Well, it's important to understand that in Syria, bread is central to cultural life, and it's served in almost every meal. Oftentimes, for example, tellingly, in the Middle East, one of the words for bread, aish, is also a word for life. And oftentimes before the war, if you were to go into a bazaar in Syria, you would find the most crowded place would be the bakery. Even since the war began, you find that there are bread lines that form all around the block. People wait for hours, if not days, to try to get bread. Unfortunately, then, it is a strategically attractive target for those attempting to both kill civilians that are sympathetic to the insurgents, as well as to break the morale of the insurgents through prolonged starvation of their friends and their families. It's estimated that since this war has begun, at least 1 in 6 bakeries have been destroyed in the rebel-held areas by Russian and Syrian airstrikes. Oftentimes, these bakeries were able to feed tens of thousands of people on a weekly basis. And it's often reported by human rights groups that are in Syria that when there is a bombing of a bakery, most often it is the only target on a military run, supporting the claim that indeed this is an intentional targeting of civilian food supplies. Some of these bakeries are run by Syrians, but others that have been targeted have been run by international nonprofits, all of whom are simply trying to feed civilians. As I speak to you now, it is estimated that nearly 500,000 people are believed to be starving in Syria. Last year, UN officials going to Syria reported back that they saw elderly and children, men and women, with little more than skin and bones, desperate for the slightest morsel. And former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, attempted to bring attention to the starvation in Syria and the direct attacks when he said, "Let me be clear, the use of starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime." For me, the abject horror of this war is that the international community is doing relatively little to try to stop it. We have important laws, internationally recognized, that are supposed to protect civilians from this fate. The Geneva Conventions are documents signed by every country in the world, and they specifically prohibit the targeting of civilians within war. And the 4th Geneva Convention specifically prohibits the targeting of civilian food supply, as well as numerous other treaties that say the same. However, it's the case that in this war, there really has been war crimes by Russia and Syria that have largely gone unchecked. How is it that if we have the laws that exist, these leaders are not held accountable before the International Criminal Court? Well, the ultimate difficulty with international law is whereas it's foundational for peace and order in our system, In its current form, it's very difficult to enforce. As I describe to my students, the international system feels a lot sometimes like a classroom filled with small children and no teacher to be found. In this situation, the rules of the game, the international law, can look a little bit like the rules written on a whiteboard. The only difference is the teachers didn't write the rules. There is no teacher. Instead, the rules were somehow agreed upon by all of the children in the room. The problem with this, as you may imagine, is when there's no teacher in the room to enforce the rules. Then every day, each child decides for his or herself whether or not they're actually going to follow these rules. Think of then Russia and Syria as those children who have absolutely decided to break the rules, and in doing so, have harmed other children in this room. As a result, you ask yourself, what are others to do, right? And why, how in the world do they get away with this? Well, unfortunately, Russia is a permanent member on the UN Security Council. Now, if we're going with the analogy of the classroom, then imagine a group of the biggest, beefiest toddlers in the room. All of them get to sit at one table, and they get to ultimately decide whether the rules are going to be followed, and if they're broken, whether or not somebody will get punished. Unsurprisingly, Russia gets to sit at this table, and ultimately has decided that neither they nor Syria will be held accountable for breaking their rules. As a result, we have to ask ourselves, what are the other children in the classroom to do? Okay? If we choose to ignore the fact that some kids are breaking the rules, then ultimately international law may be dismantled. It may not actually work. If we really honestly do not believe in it and do not hold them accountable, then international law no longer functions. Fortunately, I believe that with millions of caring people in the world, we can work to actually preserve the common rules that we all have created and that we all hold as valuable. As we sit here, however, far removed from the conflict as other people are fighting for their very survival, it may seem difficult to imagine what role we can play. I see our responsibility in two ways. More fundamentally, I see that we have the power to be responsible and more responsibility to actually address that power. And I see ourselves as both global citizens and reminding ourselves that we are citizens of the most powerful nation on earth. So as global citizens, I see that there are three things that you and I can do. First, I strongly encourage you to stay informed of the international realm. Students, take a class in international relations. We'd be happy to have you. And I promise, whereas before I definitely focused on the politically and military powerful in conflicts, I also will commit to you that I will bring in the human that is in the war or in a situation not of their choosing. Students and non-students alike, I encourage you all to stay informed by subscribing to and paying for media that provides international stories that are rigorously researched. And finally, as global citizens, something you can do is provide bread to the Syrian civilians. There is one organization that does an excellent job named Mercy Corps. It's an American organization traditionally funded by the US State Department that originally worked on the ground in Syria providing flour to the bakeries that I just spoke about. Well, after several years of struggling to do this, the Syrian government expelled the Mercy Corps from its borders. Mercy Corps, rather than giving up, moved to Turkey and kept supplying flour to the Syrian conflict, to those bakeries in need, until just 2 weeks ago, when Turkey also expelled Mercy Corps from its borders. Many believe it's because Mercy Corps is committed to provide bread for all those in need, rather than just to those whom Turkey is loyal to. As a result, as this organization is desperately looking for a new location, it could use your help, your contribution. And as members of the most powerful nation on earth, it's important to remember that our strong democracy can work for in others' favor. Call your lawmakers. First, explain to them that the current administration's preliminary plan would reduce the State Department's budget by 37%. This would drastically decrease the State Department's ability to provide humanitarian assistance all around the world, including to Mercy Corps, organizations providing help on the ground right now in Syria. Please consider voicing your opposition to such extreme cuts. Second, also encourage them to consider a diplomatic approach to this war that would have lasting humanitarian relief. And third, more broadly, please remind them that the American values that they and we hold so dearly have a place in the international order of the future. We are absolutely the America that the world believes in when we help to alleviate the deep suffering and starvation of others. Yes, one of the greatest threats, I believe, to the international system is that a few powerful states can potentially dismantle peace and order. But I also believe that the passion of the vigilant masses like us to work to uphold international law and the values that undergird it will bring peace and ease the suffering in Syria and around the world. Thank you.